Imagine if a country held one of the richest oil reserves on Earth. Imagine its people elected a leader who made a simple promise. Our oil should belong to us. No invasion followed, no declaration of war, no foreign army crossed the border. Yet within just 2 years, that government was gone. Not because its people voted it out, not because it lost a war, but because newspapers were secretly paid to spread lies. Politicians accepted hidden money. Street gangs suddenly filled the capital with carefully organized chaos. Military officers changed sides. A frightened monarch signed a few pieces of paper. And behind it all, two foreign intelligence agencies quietly pulled the strings. The official story said it was about stopping communism. The real story is far more uncomfortable. It was about protecting an oil empire. Most people think the hostility between Iran and the West began with the Islamic Revolution in 1979. Others point to the hostage crisis, nuclear negotiations, sanctions, or the endless cycle of proxy wars that still dominates headlines today. But those events were not the beginning. They were consequences. To understand why one of the most volatile relationships in modern history still shapes global politics, you have to go back more than 70 years, a moment when one democratically elected prime minister made a decision that challenged one of the world's greatest empires. His name was Mohammad Mossadegh. His belief was remarkably simple. A nation's natural resources should belong to its own people. For that belief, he would lose his government, his freedom, and eventually his place in much of Western history. But removing one man was never the true objective. The real prize was something buried thousands of feet beneath Iranian soil. And once you discover how that prize reshaped the fate of an entire region, you'll never look at today's Middle East or the language of democracy and freedom in quite the same way again. Because this story doesn't really begin with the Cold War. It begins with a single oil deal that should never have happened. Long before covert operations, propaganda campaigns, or secret intelligence meetings, the future of Iran was being shaped by a contract. In 1901, Persia was a country in decline. The Qajar dynasty struggled with debt, its government lacked modern institutions, and European powers saw opportunity everywhere they looked. To Britain, Persia wasn't simply another nation on the map. It was a place that might be hiding something far more valuable beneath its soil. That opportunity arrived in the form of a wealthy British investor named William Knox Darcy. Darcy wasn't a geologist. He wasn't an engineer. He was a businessman willing to gamble enormous sums of money on the possibility that Persia contained vast oil reserves. The agreement he secured was astonishing. For what amounted to a relatively small payment in cash, company shares, and a promise of future royalties, Darcy received the exclusive right to search for, extract, and sell oil across an enormous portion of Persian territory. It covered nearly 500,000 square miles in area, larger than many countries. Even by the standards of the early 20th century, it was an extraordinary concession. But this wasn't a negotiation between equals. The Persian government desperately needed money. British officials actively supported the agreement. Key figures inside the Persian court were influenced before the deal was finalized. What looked like a commercial contract on paper reflected a massive imbalance of power in reality. Even then, success wasn't guaranteed. Finding oil proved far more difficult than anyone expected. The drilling teams battled extreme heat during the day, freezing temperatures at night, unforgiving terrain, and constant logistical problems. Year after year, money disappeared with almost nothing to show for it. Investors became impatient. Costs kept climbing. Eventually, they decided enough was enough. A message was sent ordering the drilling to stop. Then, almost unbelievably, everything changed. Just before the operation was abandoned, a drilling crew struck a massive oil field at Mashed Soliman. After years of failure, crude oil burst from the ground in commercial quantities. That single discovery transformed Persia forever. In 1909, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company was created to develop the field. Over time, it would change names, expand across the globe, and eventually become the company the world now knows as BP. At first glance, this looked like an extraordinary business success, but it would soon become something much bigger than a private company. Because only a few years later, Europe moved toward a war unlike anything the world had ever seen. And one British leader realized that whoever controlled Persian oil might also control the future of an empire. That decision would change far more than Britain's navy. It would redefine the relationship between Britain and Iran for generations to come. Finding oil was only the beginning. The real transformation came a few years later, when Britain made a decision that changed the balance of power forever. In 1914, as Europe stood on the edge of the First World War, Winston Churchill pushed the Royal Navy to abandon coal and switch to oil. It was a revolutionary move. Oil-powered warships could travel farther, move faster, and operate far more efficiently than fleets fueled by coal. But there was one problem. Britain had almost no oil of its own. It needed a secure supply that no rival could threaten. Persia offered exactly that. The British government purchased a controlling stake in the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, turning what had started as a private business venture into something far more important. Iranian oil was no longer simply a commercial asset. It had become a strategic pillar of the British Empire. From Britain's perspective, it was a masterstroke. From Iran's perspective, it meant something entirely different. Its most valuable natural resource was now effectively controlled by a foreign government. As production expanded, so did the gap between those who benefited and those who did the work. Nowhere was that contrast more visible than in Abadan, home to one of the largest oil refineries in the world. British managers lived in carefully planned neighborhoods with spacious homes, green lawns, swimming pools, cinemas, and modern comforts that were almost unimaginable elsewhere in the region. Just beyond those neighborhoods lived the Iranian workers who kept the refinery running. Many returned each night to overcrowded settlements built from scrap materials. Basic necessities like clean water, electricity, and proper sanitation were often missing. The men whose labor produced one of the world's most valuable commodities lived in conditions that reflected almost none of the wealth flowing from the oil beneath their feet. The imbalance extended far beyond living conditions. Iran received only a small share of the profits generated from its own resources. When Iranian officials requested access to the company's financial records to verify royalty payments, they were refused. Without access to the books, there was no way to know whether the country was even receiving the amount it had been promised. The numbers only deepened the resentment. By the late 1940s, the British government collected more in taxes from the company than Iran earned in royalties from its own oil. Think about what that meant. A foreign government was making more money from Iranian oil than the nation that actually owned the resource. And it didn't stop there. Revenue generated from Iranian crude helped finance the company's global expansion, new refineries, new tankers, and new oil projects around the world. Yet much of that growing business wasn't fully reflected when calculating Iran's payments. To many Iranians, this no longer looked like an unfair contract. It looked like a system deliberately designed to enrich one nation while keeping another permanently dependent. By the end of the 1940s, frustration had spread far beyond politicians. Workers felt it. Business owners felt it. Students felt it. Even members of Iran's political establishment could no longer defend the arrangement. The question was no longer whether the system was unfair. The question had become who would finally challenge it. That answer would arrive in the form of an unlikely politician whose greatest weapon wasn't an army, but the belief that a nation should control its own future. By the late 1940s, the fight over Iran's oil was no longer just an economic dispute. It had become a question of national dignity. For decades, ordinary Iranians had watched enormous wealth leave their country while they received little in return. Every failed negotiation, every rejected request to inspect company records, and every reminder of Britain's privileged position added to a growing sense that something had to change. Then one man stepped forward. His name was Mohammad Mossadegh. At first glance, he hardly looked like the kind of leader who would challenge one of the world's most powerful empires. He wasn't a military commander. He wasn't a revolutionary. He came from an aristocratic family, studied law in Europe, and built his career through constitutional politics. Those who met him often described him as emotional and unconventional. He was known to cry during speeches, receive visitors while resting in bed, and occasionally faint during long parliamentary debates. To critics, he seemed eccentric. To supporters, those quirks didn't matter. What mattered was that, unlike many politicians before him, he refused to accept that Iran should remain dependent on foreign control. For years, Mossadegh argued that Iran's natural resources belonged to the Iranian people, not to a foreign corporation, and certainly not to a foreign government. That message resonated across nearly every corner of Iranian society. Liberals supported him, nationalists rallied behind him, religious figures found common ground with him. Even groups that disagreed on almost everything else shared one common demand. Iran's oil had to come home. To unite those voices, Mossadegh helped organize what became known as the National Front, a coalition built around a single objective: nationalizing the country's oil industry. Momentum grew quickly. Then, history took an unexpected turn. In March 1951, Prime Minister Ali Razmara, one of the strongest opponents of nationalization, was assassinated. The political landscape changed almost overnight. Only days later, the Iranian parliament voted on whether the oil industry should be nationalized. The result was extraordinary. The proposal passed unanimously. Not one member voted against it. Shortly afterward, Mossadegh was chosen as prime minister. Within days of taking office, he signed the law that officially transferred control of Iran's oil industry from the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company to the newly created National Iranian Oil Company. For millions of Iranians, it was a historic moment. After decades of frustration, it appeared that their country's greatest resource finally belonged to its rightful owner. But in London, the reaction could not have been more different. British officials didn't see nationalization as an act of sovereignty. They saw it as theft. To them, the oil industry had been built with British investment, British technology, and British expertise. In their minds, Iran wasn't reclaiming its own wealth, it was taking Britain's. That difference in perspective changed everything, because from that moment forward, Britain stopped looking for ways to negotiate. It began looking for ways to remove the man who had taken its oil away. The battle over Iran's future was no longer being fought inside Parliament. It was about to become an international confrontation with consequences far beyond oil itself. Britain wasn't prepared to send an army into Iran. At least, not yet. Instead, it reached for another weapon: economic pressure. If Iran insisted on keeping its oil, Britain would make sure no one could buy it. London imposed a sweeping embargo on Iranian oil exports. British warships moved into the Persian Gulf, making it clear that transporting Iranian crude would carry serious risks. At the same time, Britain warned foreign governments and private companies that doing business with Iran could trigger legal consequences. The message was simple: buying Iranian oil would come at a price. The strategy worked better than many expected. The world's largest Western oil companies refused to handle Iranian crude. Rather than replacing the lost supply from Iran, they simply increased production elsewhere in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Iraq filled much of the gap, allowing global markets to keep moving while Iran's economy absorbed the full impact of the embargo. The consequences inside Iran were devastating. Oil production collapsed. The massive refinery at Abadan, once one of the largest in the world, slowed dramatically and eventually shut down. British technicians left the country, taking with them much of the technical expertise needed to keep operations running smoothly. The resource Iran had fought so hard to reclaim suddenly became almost impossible to sell. But Britain wasn't relying on economic pressure alone. It launched a diplomatic offensive as well. The dispute was taken before the International Court of Justice and the United Nations Security Council. Britain hoped international institutions would force Iran to reverse nationalization or at least isolate Mossadegh politically. Instead, something unexpected happened. Mossadegh chose to defend Iran's position personally. He traveled abroad and argued that the issue wasn't about confiscating foreign property. It was about a sovereign nation exercising its right to control its own natural resources. His speeches attracted worldwide attention and presented Iran not as an aggressor, but as a country demanding fair treatment. Eventually, the International Court of Justice declined to intervene, effectively denying Britain the legal victory it had hoped for. For Iran, it was an important symbolic success. For Britain, it was a major frustration. The courts hadn't delivered the outcome London wanted. The embargo hadn't forced Mossadegh to surrender. Negotiations had reached a dead end. One by one, the conventional tools of pressure were failing. Inside the British government, patience began to disappear. If economic warfare couldn't break Mossadegh, if diplomacy couldn't remove him, then perhaps another method could. Long before the public knew anything about it, British intelligence officers had already begun discussing a far more dangerous solution. Not another lawsuit, not another negotiation. A government change. Quietly, MI6 started building contacts inside Iran, identifying military officers, political allies, and influential figures who might prove useful if the moment ever came. That secret effort became known as Operation Boot. But there was one problem. Britain no longer had enough influence inside Iran to carry out such a plan on its own. If Mossadegh was going to be overthrown, Britain would need help from someone far more powerful. And that meant convincing the United States that this wasn't a fight over oil, but a fight against communism. By late 1952, Britain had exhausted nearly every conventional option. Economic pressure had crippled Iran's oil industry, but Mossadegh refused to surrender. Legal challenges had failed. Diplomatic negotiations had gone nowhere. And after Mossadegh expelled British diplomats from Tehran over intelligence activities, London's ability to operate inside Iran became even more limited. Britain had reached an uncomfortable conclusion. If Mossadegh was going to be removed, it couldn't do the job alone. It needed another Its only realistic partner was the United States. At first, Washington wasn't convinced. President Harry Truman viewed the crisis very differently from the British government. His administration understood that Iranian nationalism wasn't the same thing as communism. American officials believed a negotiated settlement was still possible and repeatedly encouraged Britain to make meaningful compromises instead of treating nationalization as an act of theft. For a time, that position protected Mossadegh. The United States wasn't interested in overthrowing a democratically elected government simply because Britain had lost control of an oil company. But politics in Washington were changing. When Dwight D. Eisenhower entered the White House in January 1953, a new foreign policy team arrived with him. Among its most influential members were Secretary of State John Foster Dulles and his brother, Allen Dulles, the director of Central Intelligence. Unlike the previous administration, the Dulles brothers viewed nearly every international crisis through the lens of the Cold War. To them, instability created opportunity. And opportunity often meant Soviet influence. Britain immediately recognized the opening. Instead of arguing that Mossadegh threatened British oil interests, British officials completely changed the conversation. They stopped talking about petroleum. They started talking about communism. Iran's nationalist movement was portrayed as a dangerous step toward Soviet expansion. Mossadegh was described as a leader who, intentionally or not, was creating conditions that would allow Iran's Communist Tudeh party to seize power. It was an argument carefully designed for an American audience. There was only one problem. The available intelligence didn't fully support it. CIA assessments at the time concluded that a communist takeover was not considered imminent. Mossadegh himself was not presented as a Soviet ally. Yet those conclusions were overshadowed by growing fears inside Washington that losing Iran might shift the balance of power across the Middle East. In the atmosphere of the early Cold War, perception often mattered more than certainty. Once the crisis was reframed as a struggle against communism, the conversation inside Washington changed dramatically. By the spring of 1953, Allen Dulles authorized funds to support efforts aimed at removing Mossadegh from power. Meetings between British intelligence officers and CIA planners intensified as both sides refined a detailed strategy for regime change. The operation now had official approval. Britain called it Operation Boot. The Americans gave it another name, Operation Ajax. To lead the mission on the ground, the CIA selected an experienced intelligence officer with a famous family name. His name was Kermit Roosevelt, Jr. Within weeks, he would quietly enter Tehran, carrying little more than a false identity, a briefcase full of cash, and a plan capable of changing the course of Middle Eastern history. What followed wasn't a military invasion. It was something far more subtle and, in many ways, far more dangerous. When Kermit Roosevelt quietly entered Tehran in July 1953, he wasn't leading an army. He wasn't carrying military plans for an invasion. His most powerful weapon wasn't a rifle. It was influence. Operation Ajax depended on one simple idea. If enough people could be convinced that Iran was falling apart, then removing its government could be presented as restoring order instead of destroying democracy. The campaign began long before anyone marched through the streets. For weeks, newspapers across Tehran carried stories attacking Mossadegh. Some portrayed him as secretly sympathetic to communism. Others accused him of plotting against Islam. Still others claimed he intended to destroy the monarchy and seize absolute power for himself. Many of those stories weren't written by independent journalists at all. They were created as part of a coordinated propaganda campaign. Articles were drafted, translated into Persian, and quietly placed inside local newspapers to make them appear authentic. To ordinary readers, they looked like genuine reporting. In reality, they were carefully engineered political weapons. The objective wasn't necessarily to convince everyone. It was to create uncertainty. If enough different accusations appeared at the same time, people would begin questioning what was true and what wasn't. Confusion itself became a strategy. But words alone wouldn't be enough. Money became the next weapon. CIA funds flowed through trusted intermediaries to politicians willing to criticize Mossadegh publicly. Newspaper editors received financial support. Religious figures were encouraged to speak against the government. Influential military officers were quietly approached behind closed doors. The operation reached far beyond political elites. Street gang leaders were also paid. Their job wasn't simply to protest. Their job was to manufacture instability. Violence would erupt in one neighborhood. Crowds would suddenly appear in another. Public figures would be threatened or attacked. The goal was to convince ordinary Iranians that the government was losing control of the country. The appearance of chaos was almost as valuable as real chaos itself. Yet despite months of planning, one critical obstacle remained: the Shah. Under Iran's constitutional system, the Shah still possessed the legal authority to dismiss the prime minister. Without his signature, removing Mossadegh would look like nothing more than an obvious military coup. With it, the conspirators could argue they were simply carrying out a lawful royal decree. There was just one problem. The Shah was terrified. He understood the risks better than anyone. If the operation failed, Mossadegh would almost certainly remove him from power. For days, he hesitated. American and British officials worked relentlessly to reassure him that key military commanders were already committed to the plan. Even members of the royal family and trusted foreign contacts were drawn into the effort to persuade the increasingly nervous monarch. Finally, after enormous pressure, the Shah agreed. On the 13th of August, 1953, he signed 2 royal decrees. One dismissed Mohammad Mossadegh as prime minister. The other appointed General Fazlollah Zahedi as his replacement. On paper, Everything was now in place. The propaganda network was active. Money had been distributed. Military contacts were standing by. The royal decrees were signed. From the perspective of the planners, Operation Ajax was ready. All that remained was to deliver the order, arrest Mossadegh, and watch the government collapse. It looked almost effortless. But history rarely follows the script. Within 48 hours, the entire operation would appear to have failed, and many believed the coup was already over. The first phase of Operation Ajax ended in disaster. Late on the night of August 15, Colonel Nematollah Nasiri arrived with the Shah's royal decree dismissing Mossadegh as prime minister. The plan seemed straightforward. Present the decree, arrest Mossadegh, and transfer power before organized resistance could form. Instead, everything went wrong. Mossadegh had already been warned. Whether the information came through loyal officers or from members of the Tudeh party who had infiltrated parts of the military, the result was the same. When Nasiri arrived, he wasn't the one making an arrest. He was the one being arrested. Across Tehran, other conspirators were quickly rounded up. The carefully prepared operation appeared to collapse almost overnight. News spread rapidly. The Shah panicked. Convinced that his reign had come to an end, he fled Iran first to Baghdad, then to Rome. From exile, he watched events unfold, believing he would never sit on the peacock throne again. In Washington, the mood was equally grim. CIA headquarters concluded that the mission had failed and sent instructions ordering Kermit Roosevelt to abandon the operation and leave Iran immediately. For most intelligence officers, that would have been the end of the story. Roosevelt chose a different path. He ignored the order. According to later accounts, he refused to accept that months of planning would end after a single setback. Instead of leaving Tehran, he disappeared deeper into the city. Meeting with remaining contacts and rebuilding the network almost from scratch, money began flowing again. Political allies who had lost confidence were persuaded to return. Military officers who had gone silent were contacted once more. Supporters who had scattered after the failed attempt slowly regrouped. Meanwhile, Mossadegh believed the danger had passed. Confident that the conspiracy had been crushed, he encouraged many of his supporters to return home. Even groups that had been helping defend the streets were told to stand down. It was an understandable decision, but it created exactly the opening Roosevelt needed. On the morning of August 19, Tehran looked very different. Crowds suddenly appeared across the city. Many carried portraits of the Shah. Others shouted pro-monarchy slogans. Some had gathered out of genuine loyalty. Others had been organized and paid to be there. What mattered wasn't why they came. What mattered was how they made the city appear. The demonstrations grew larger by the hour. At the same time, military units loyal to General Fazlollah Zahedi began seizing key government facilities. Communication centers, radio stations, and strategic positions gradually fell under their control. The momentum shifted with astonishing speed. By afternoon, tanks surrounded Mossadegh's residence. Gunfire erupted. Artillery shells struck the compound as fighting spread through parts of the capital. For hours, Tehran descended into chaos. By the end of the day, hundreds of people were dead or wounded. Mossadegh escaped the bombardment by climbing over a garden wall, but the victory was only temporary. The following day, he surrendered. Iran's democratically elected government had fallen. General Zahedi became prime minister. Soon afterward, the Shah returned from exile to a carefully orchestrated public celebration. For many observers, Operation Ajax had achieved exactly what it was designed to accomplish. A government had been removed. A monarchy had been restored. Order, at least on the surface, appeared to have returned, but removing Mossadegh had never been the final objective. It had simply cleared the path for something far more valuable. The battle had never been about one man. It had always been about who would control Iran's oil. Once Mossadegh was gone, events moved quickly. The political crisis that had dominated international headlines suddenly faded. Behind closed doors, attention shifted to the issue that had driven the entire confrontation from the beginning: Iran's oil. In 1954, a new agreement reorganized the country's petroleum industry. Officially, Iran still possessed its national oil company. On paper, national ownership remained. But the reality looked very different. A consortium of major Western companies assumed control over production, international sales, pricing, and access to global markets. British Petroleum, successor to the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, retained a major share. Several American oil companies received an equally significant portion. Other European firms also secured their place in the arrangement. The structure had changed. The outcome had not. The resource Mossadegh had fought to reclaim for the Iranian people once again flowed through foreign-controlled commercial networks. The difference was that Britain no longer stood alone. The United States had become a full partner. For Washington and London, the operation appeared to be a remarkable success. Oil exports resumed. Iran remained aligned with the West. The feared communist takeover never occurred. From the perspective of policymakers, covert action had produced results that diplomacy could not. Inside Iran, however, another transformation was taking place. The Shah understood that his restored authority depended heavily on foreign support. Determined to prevent another challenge like Mossadegh's, he moved to strengthen his control over every part of the political system. With assistance from American and Israeli intelligence services, a new security organization emerged. Its name became widely feared: Savak. Its responsibilities extended far beyond ordinary law enforcement. Political opponents were monitored, government employees were screened, newspapers faced censorship. Universities came under increasing surveillance. Opposition movements found themselves under constant pressure. Over time, Savak developed a reputation for methods that made its name synonymous with fear throughout Iran. The constitutional system that had once allowed open political competition steadily narrowed. Parties weakened. Independent organizations struggled to survive. Many of the democratic institutions that had existed under Mossadegh gradually disappeared. To outside observers, Iran looked stable. Economic growth returned, oil flowed, the monarchy appeared secure. But beneath that appearance of stability, frustration continued to build. The grievances that had fueled the nationalization movement never truly disappeared. They simply found new targets. And over the next 25 years, those frustrations would grow into something no intelligence agency had predicted. The operation that seemed to guarantee stability was quietly laying the foundation for an even greater upheaval. History has a way of refusing to stay in the past. For years after the coup, Iran appeared to be one of America's strongest partners in the Middle East. The Shah invested heavily in modernization projects, expanding infrastructure, industry, education, and the military. To many outside observers, the country looked like a success story. But prosperity was uneven. Oil wealth did not transform society equally. Many ordinary Iranians felt excluded from the benefits of rapid modernization. Traditional economic networks faced growing pressure, while political freedoms became increasingly limited. At the same time, Savak's reach continued to expand. Critics feared surveillance. Opponents risked arrest. Public dissent became increasingly dangerous. What had once been political frustration slowly evolved into deep resentment, and beneath all of it remained a memory that refused to disappear: the events of 1953. For many Iranians, the overthrow of Mossadegh became more than a historical episode. It became proof that foreign governments would intervene whenever Iran attempted to control its own future. By the late 1970s, those emotions had reached a breaking point. A remarkably broad coalition of religious leaders, secular intellectuals, students, workers, and many others found themselves united against the Shah's rule. The revolution that followed was driven by numerous political, economic, and social grievances. But the memory of foreign intervention remained one of its most powerful symbols. When revolutionaries seized the American embassy in Tehran in 1979 and took dozens of hostages, they didn't see the embassy as just another diplomatic building. To them, it represented the place from which the earlier coup had been directed. They feared history could repeat itself. The hostage crisis shattered relations between Iran and the United States. Decades of distrust followed. Sanctions, diplomatic confrontation, nuclear disputes, proxy conflicts across the Middle East. The political landscape continued changing, but the shadow of 1953 never completely disappeared. Years later, American officials publicly acknowledged the United States' role in the coup. Over time, previously classified documents confirmed the CIA's central involvement. Those acknowledgments became important historical milestones. They did not erase the consequences. By then, generations had already grown up, shaped by decisions made during a few critical days in August 1953. Perhaps that is the most enduring lesson of this story. Governments often measure success by immediate objectives. A crisis is resolved, an ally is restored, strategic interests are protected. But history measures success differently. It asks what happened 20 years later, or 50, or 70. Operation Ajax achieved its immediate mission. Yet many of the regional tensions that continue to influence global politics today can trace part of their history back to that same operation. A government was overthrown, an empire protected its interests, but the consequences proved impossible to contain, because history rarely ends when an operation succeeds. Sometimes that's exactly where the real story begins. For many people, the story of Iran in 1953 is simply another Cold War episode buried in history books, but it's far more than that. It's a reminder that political slogans and public explanations don't always reveal the real forces driving international events. Sometimes the battle isn't fought over ideology. Sometimes it isn't fought over democracy. Sometimes it begins with something far more tangible: resources, power, influence. Mohammad Mossadegh believed that a nation's wealth should belong to its own people. Whether one agrees with every decision he made or not, his removal became one of the defining turning points in modern Middle Eastern history. And decades later, the consequences continue to shape relationships between nations, influence foreign policy, and affect millions of lives far beyond Iran's borders. History isn't just about understanding what happened. It's about recognizing how yesterday's hidden decisions become today's headlines. That's why stories like this still matter, because the past is rarely finished with us. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most consequential hidden turning points, we'd love to hear your perspective. Do you think events in the Middle East would have unfolded differently if Mossadegh had remained in office? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy thoughtful historical documentaries that uncover the forgotten forces behind world-changing events, consider supporting Forgotten Code by liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and turning on notifications so you won't miss our next story. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next documentary.